The key turned in the lock with a weary sigh as Emily stepped into her silent apartment. The emptiness seemed to echo, magnifying the hollowness that had taken root inside her chest these past months. She went through the motions of hanging her coat, setting down her purse, each small action feeling disconnected, as if belonging to someone else's life. At work, she moved through her days like a ghost, conversations washing over her without leaving a mark. Colleagues' faces blurred together, their smiles polite but distant. She wondered if they could see the loneliness etched into her features, if they noticed how her own smiles never quite reached her eyes. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between tasks, her mind would drift to memories of laughter shared with friends, of inside jokes, and nights spent dreaming of the future. But those friends were scattered now, their paths diverged, and the weight of solitude pressed heavier with each passing day. With a heavy sigh, Emily moved to the kitchen, reaching for the kettle to prepare her nightly tea. As she waited for the water to boil, she caught her reflection in the dark window above the sink. In the glass, her face seemed to belong to a stranger, shadows pooling beneath eyes that had forgotten how to sparkle. A sudden movement in the reflection made her heart seize. A figure emerging from the darkness of her living room. Emily whirled around, her scream lodged in her throat as rough hands grabbed her, silencing her cry. Panic rose like bile as her world tilted, faded, fell away into nothingness. She awoke with a throb behind her temples, her mouth cottony. Blinking, she tried to make sense of her surroundings' bare walls, a single window too high to reach, the unyielding coldness of a concrete floor beneath her. The events of the previous night crashed over her, and she jackknifed upright, a scream tearing free from her raw throat. But the room swallowed the sound, the padded walls dampening her desperate cries into pathetic, muffled whimpers. She clawed at the door until her fingers bled, shouted until her voice splintered into painful shards. No one came. No one heard. As hours dragged into days, the terrible realization settled over Emily like a shroud. She was utterly alone, trapped in a nightmare from which she might never wake. In the harrowing silence, the magnitude of her isolation crashed down upon her, and she sank to the floor, sobs racking her body as the shadows pressed in, cold and unforgiving. In the suffocating silence of her prison, time lost all meaning. Emily marked the crawling hours by the thin slants of light that crept across the floor from the singular window above. Her mind, once her sanctuary, now twisted every moment into an endless reel of horrors. Loneliness, once a familiar ache, now took on a new, horrifying meaning. In this void of human connection, even the slightest sound, the creak of a floorboard, the rattle of a lock, sent her heart racing with a toxic cocktail of hope and dread. The first time he appeared, silhouetted in the doorway like a figure from a nightmare, Emily cowered against the wall, her voice hoarse from screaming. He set down a tray of food, a mockery of normalcy in this surreal hell, and studied her with cold, assessing eyes that seemed to flay her to her core. "No one is coming for you," he said, his voice a low rasp that echoed in the hollows of her mind long after he was gone. "You're mine now." The words settled like ice in her veins, chilling her more than the unforgiving concrete beneath her. Because in the emptiness of her old life, in the meaningless interactions and solitary routines, a horrifying truth began to take shape. There was no one to notice her absence, no one to raise an alarm. In rare moments of lucidity between bouts of paralyzing terror, fragments of overheard conversations would drift through her mind. A phone call, low and terse, the words, "She quit," and, leaving town, slithering through the cracks beneath the door. Her captor, meticulously severing the tenuous threads that tied her to the world outside. As days bled into weeks, Emily felt pieces of herself crumbling, falling away. The fight drained from her limbs, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. She found herself watching the door, not with dread, but with a desperate, sickening sort of anticipation. His visits, once terrifying, now punctuated her solitude with moments of human contact, however twisted. He began to linger, to speak to her in low tones that almost resembled kindness, praising her compliance, her obedience. And in the darkest corners of her psyche, a traitorous voice whispered that perhaps this was all she deserved. That maybe, in the twisted tapestry of her life, this was the role she was meant to play. Even as revulsion churned in her gut, Emily felt the insidious tendrils of doubt taking hold, corrupting her thoughts. The outside world began to feel more distant, more threatening than the confines of her cell. And so, as the shadows lengthened and the whispers grew louder, Emily felt herself begin to splinter, to warp beneath the weight of her isolation. In the absence of all other human connection, her captor became her focal point, her twisted anchor in a sea of madness. She knew, somewhere deep within, that this was survival, not affection. A desperate grasping for any shred of humanity in an inhuman situation. But as she listened for his footsteps in the hallway, as she leaned into his touch like a flower starved for sunlight, Emily could not deny the sickening bond that had begun to form, a bond born of desperation, isolation, and the all-consuming need to feel something, anything, in a world gone mad. In the warped reality of Emily's captivity, a twisted rhythm emerged, a dance of power and submission, of fear and desperate dependence. With each interaction, the lines between abuser and savior blurred further, the boundaries of Emily's psyche eroding under the relentless tide of isolation and psychological manipulation. He began to share fragments of his life, his voice soft and almost hypnotic in the oppressive stillness of her cell. Tales of betrayal and abandonment poured from his lips, painting a picture of a man shattered by the cruelties of fate. Against her will, Emily felt the first stirrings of empathy, her heart aching for the broken child hidden beneath the monster's facade. In those moments, when the weight of her own shattered life threatened to crush her, she clung to these shards of shared pain, desperate for any connection in the void of her existence. As the days bled together, marked only by the shifting shadows on the walls, Emily found herself watching for his visits with a mixture of dread and longing. His presence, once a source of terror, now represented the only escape from the suffocating silence of her own mind. He began to allow her small freedoms, a book to pass the endless hours, a softer blanket to ward off the bone-deep chill of the concrete floor. Each concession felt like a lifeline, a fragile thread of humanity in an increasingly inhuman world. But even as she grasped at these small comforts, a part of Emily recoiled in disgust at her own weakness, at the insidious bond forming between captive and captor. In the darkest hours of the night, when the shadows seemed to breathe with a life of their own, she would claw at the walls until her fingers bled, desperate to maintain some sense of self amidst the psychological onslaught. It was in one of these moments, as dawn light seeped through the high window, and the last of her tears dried on her cheeks, that Emily noticed the change. His breathing, once steady and strong, had grown labored, punctuated by fits of wet, hacking coughs. His movements, once precise and controlled, now seemed heavy, burdened. As the days passed, his condition worsened, his visits growing shorter and less frequent. Emily found herself consumed with a new kind of dread, not of his presence, but of his absence. In the twisted landscape of her captivity, his existence had become the only constant, the only proof that she was still alive, still human. When he finally collapsed at her feet, his skin ashen and slick with sweat, Emily felt a sickening surge of panic. With trembling hands, she cradled his head, his ragged breaths hot against her skin as he whispered his final confession. "I just didn't want to die alone," he rasped, his eyes fever-bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry." As his words faded, his body growing still in her arms, Emily felt something within her shatter. A scream tore from her throat, raw and primal, as the full weight of her isolation crashed down upon her. She was alone, utterly and completely, tethered to reality only by the still warm corpse of her tormentor. In that moment, as the shadows pressed in and the silence roared in her ears, Emily faced a choice. To succumb to the madness clawing at the edges of her psyche, or to cling to the fraying threads of her sanity, and fight her way back to a world that had forgotten her. With shaking limbs, and a heart heavy with grief and trauma, Emily staggered to her feet. She knew the path ahead would be treacherous, that the scars etched into her mind would never fully fade. But as she stepped over the threshold of her prison and into the blinding light of day, she felt a flicker of something long forgotten stirring in her chest. Hope, fragile and tentative, began to take root in the shattered remains of her soul. And though the road to healing would be long and arduous, Emily knew that she would walk it on her own terms, carrying the weight of her survival like a badge of honor against the indifference of the world. Emily stepped out into a world cast in shades of gray, the sun's warmth a distant memory against her pallid skin. The weight of her trauma pressed against her chest, stealing her breath and blurring her vision. Each step felt like a betrayal, as if moving forward meant leaving a piece of herself behind, forever entombed with the corpse of her captor. In the early days of her newfound freedom, Emily moved through life like a ghost, her presence barely registering in a world that had long since moved on without her. The scars of her captivity ran deep, etched into her psyche like the lines of a fractured mirror. She saw her pain reflected in every passing stranger's eyes, their gazes holding the same haunted quality that stared back at her from her own reflection. Nights were the hardest. In the stillness of her new apartment, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, their inky tendrils reaching out to ensnare her once more. Sleep became a rare and fleeting visitor, driven away by the echoes of her captor's voice that reverberated through her mind in an endless loop of psychological torment. She found herself longing for the twisted familiarity of her prison, for the perverse comfort of a bond born from shared suffering. In her darkest moments, she almost missed the weight of his presence, the feeling of being seen, even if only through the lens of cruelty and control. Slowly, painfully, Emily began to untangle the knots of her trauma, to separate the strands of her own identity from the snarled web of her captor's influence. She learned to find solace in the small moments of beauty that had once seemed lost to her, the warmth of sunlight on her skin, the sound of laughter drifting on the breeze, the taste of freedom in every breath. But even as she began to rebuild her life, piece by jagged piece, Emily could not shake the sense of profound isolation that clung to her like a second skin. The connections she had once taken for granted, the easy camaraderie of the workplace, the comfort of familial bonds, now felt like relics of a past life, as distant and unreachable as the stars. In the quiet moments between the chaos of healing, Emily often found herself wondering about the man who had shattered her world so completely. She replayed their final moments together in her mind, dissecting each word, each gesture, searching for some glimmer of humanity beneath the monster's mask. A part of her, the part still raw and bleeding from the wounds of her captivity, yearned to understand him, to find some twisted sense of closure in the knowledge of his motives. But another part, the part that had clawed its way out of the abyss and into the light, recoiled at the thought, knowing that to seek understanding was to invite the darkness back in. And so Emily learned to live with the unanswered questions, to accept the scars as a part of her story, but not the whole of it. She learned to find strength in her own resilience, in the knowledge that she had survived the unsurvivable, and emerged on the other side a different person, fractured, but not broken. In the end, as the years slipped by and the sharpness of her pain dulled to a distant ache, Emily came to understand that healing was not a destination, but a journey. A winding path, littered with setbacks and detours, but one that she would walk on her own terms, guided by the light of her own inner strength. And though the shadows of her past would always be a part of her, Emily knew that they did not define her. For she was more than the sum of her scars. She was a survivor, a fighter, a woman who had stared into the face of darkness and emerged, forever changed, but undefeated. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Watch our new stories here.